I've got a nice collection of annuals here, and in this video I'm going to show you some tricks for planting these. Now I know you think planting annuals is pretty easy, and it is, but there are some tricks you can use to give you better flower power all summer long, and that's what the focus of this video is all about. We're going to discuss a few things, and then I'm going to take you over to the garden and show you how I plant them. Before we talk about planting, it's worthwhile talking about buying. How do you buy a good annual? There are a couple options. This dahlia here comes in a pot and is a single plant in a fairly large pot for an annual. This is the more traditional way of buying annuals. They come in these 4-packs. The amount of soil for each plant is small. The plant itself is small. But these are a lot less expensive than these. When I buy these here, they cost me about 50 cents a plant Canadian, whereas this guy over here is anywhere from $3 to $5 depending on where I buy them. So which is a better deal? Well, years gone by, all your annuals came this way and they worked just fine. In fact, when I first started gardening, I grew my own petunias from seed, and I would grow them in packs like this. And my plants would be quite small when they went in the garden. By mid and late summer, my petunias were huge and just covered with flowers. And all my neighbors came over and said, "Well, what are you doing different than me? How come yours grow so well?" Well, the answer was pretty simple. I started with small plants. They started with larger plants. When you start with larger plants, they just don't last all summer long. They're too big for these pots. They're already stressed. You're much better off buying small plants and having smaller plants for the first few weeks of the summer, but ending the summer with a bang of color. If you buy smaller plants, you're going to be able to buy more and cover an area with more plants, which again will give you more flower power. This is the way you should buy your plants. This one is sold mostly to gardeners who want instant flower power. Now I have a mixture of these because you can't buy all of these in small cells like this. Dahlias tend to come in larger pots. When I'm buying petunias and marigolds, I want them in small pots like this. And I'd rather buy more at a lower price. This is a really beautiful dahlia. Love the color. Now I'm going to plant this today, but there's something I do with these plants before I plant them. And for most of you, you're going to have a hard time doing this, but it really is the best way to plant annuals. You got to take these off. It's got buds coming here. I'm going to take the buds off as well. Well, why do that? I mean, now I have a plant with no flowers. When I put this in the ground, I want this plant to focus on one thing: growing better roots. I don't want it to flower right now. I will sacrifice today's flower for better roots, which will give me a lot more flowers in mid and late summer. Now, I usually don't pinch these off until after I've planted it. That way I know which color is which. But when I finish planting my annuals, I always come and snip the flowers and maybe even the buds off. It also allows the plant to put more energy into growing more leaves and more side branches. Again, that gives me a healthier plant for a better bloom later in the season. It does mean for the next week or two, I won't get flowers on here. So there is a trade-off there. Here's another important point. If you look at the soil in all these pots, it's not really soil, it's a soilless mix. And around here in southern Ontario, it's almost always peat moss, because we have a good, inexpensive source in Canada for peat moss. In your area, it might be coir, which is ground up coconut husk, or it could be some sort of wood fibers. But whatever it is, it's not soil. So when I go to plant this, I have a fundamental problem. I have a mixture of non-soil here and soil beside it here. Most of these soilless mixes dry out faster than the soil around it, particularly in my area, because we have a relatively high amount of clay. Why is that important? Because it determines the depth you plant these. The general rule of thumb is to plant these at the same height that they're in the pot. And that doesn't really work very well. If I plant this so that the height of this soil is the same as the height of my garden soil, then what happens is my garden soil dries slowly and this soil dries quickly. The soil around the roots is always dry, and when peat moss gets too dry, it's too hard to wet. So now this annual is sitting in this clay soil, lots of moisture around it, but right around the roots it's dry, and even when I water it, that peat moss doesn't pick up the water properly. The solution for that is to take these and set them a little lower in the soil. So I end up with a 1/2 inch to 1 inch of my native soil covering this soil so that it keeps this wet. So I sink these in a little bit deeper than they are in the pot. And generally I find that doesn't harm any of these plants. Now I'm not going crazy, I'm not going down 3-4 inches, but a little bit. I want the surface covered with my native soil. The other trick I use when I'm planting annuals is that I might modify the roots before I plant them. But that depends on what I have. So let's have a look at this dahlia here. I can see some roots, but not a lot of them. There are not a lot of circulating roots. If I have a look at the bottom, there are not too many roots either. This plant actually looks really good. So I probably will leave this when I plant it. I might tease this out a little bit like this, just to get some of the roots pointing into my native soil and away from the peat moss. Now these smaller cell packs probably have more roots because there's just so little soil in these. So it's very common to find these being root bound. And that's exactly what I have here. You can see this is a solid layer of roots. And you can plant it just like that and they will grow. But what I really want to do is get a bigger root system. And to help the plant do that, what I will do is actually pull off some of these roots. I will break them, open it up a little bit, and then plant that. That will get these roots growing into my native soil. And the sooner they do that, the bigger plant I will get. So just take an extra second or two and tease these apart. It's also a good idea to get some of this peat moss out of here because I want these growing in my native soil. It has more moisture, they will dry out less, and my clay soil has a high nutrient level compared to peat moss, which adds virtually no nutrients at all. Now let's put it all together and actually plant one of these. So this is the dahlia I had before. I would knock it out of the pot, have a look at the root system, try to get some of this peat moss off. Don't do too much damage to the roots because they're not circulating. I'll even take some of the top peat moss off here. Remember, I want the top of this to have my native soil, not peat moss. And since there are not a lot of roots, this is pretty easy to do here. Dig a hole, check for depth. Oh, I went a bit too deep, put some back. Press this down. You don't want the plant to sink as you're watering it. Still a little deep. Take your hand and just find the surface of the soil and come across here. Okay, that looks about right. Fill it back. Notice that my soil is covering the peat moss ball at the bottom. Pack it down gently. And we're done. You can do one of these as well. The flowers, they get nipped off. And I just use my thumb and forefinger and just kind of pinch them there. Take some of these roots off. Loosen this up a bit. There's quite a bit of roots in the top here, so I'm not going to take too much of the peat moss off here. Otherwise, I just damage the roots. I'll just bury it a little deeper. Yeah, that's a good height. Give it a press. Firm it in place. You want the soil touching that root. Now we just water it in and we're done. In a week and a half to 2 weeks, both of these will be flowering and they'll do great for the rest of the summer. Now that they're planted, how do you take care of these annuals? What about fertilizer? Well, I generally don't fertilize these. My soil has all the nutrients it needs, and in fact, most soil, at least in North America, has the nutrients these need. If you're going to do any fertilizing, use a high nitrogen fertilizer. Forget the bloom boosters. They don't work. You want a low middle number and a higher front number. The front number is the nitrogen. And nitrogen will make them grow a little faster. If you know you have a deficiency, well then fertilize to solve the deficiency. But if you haven't done a soil test and you don't know if you have a deficiency, just add a little nitrogen. The next step is watering. For the next 2 weeks, I'll keep a close eye on these and water them whenever I need to water them. I'll also mulch them within a couple days. The mulch will help hold water in, keep the soil cooler. Both of those are important for root growth. Now you might be sitting there wondering, okay, the guy just said water when needed. What does that mean? Watering is one of the things that gardeners have a very hard time getting right, partly because a lot of the advice online is wrong. People say water lots. They don't mean water often. What they're really saying is water enough so the soil stays moist. Anyways, the details of watering are critical for making plants grow, and I've covered all of that in this video right here. Happy gardening.